All right. So first, I would like to explain the dichotomy between master and slave morality. So, the dichotomy is derived from the distinction between aristocrats and peasants. So, whenever there is a civilization, there will be people who naturally rise to the top. There are people who are respected for their superior judgment, or maybe they're very good merchants, or maybe they're spiritual leaders, or whatever, right? So there's a difference in status between people, and therefore there is a hierarchy of people. And the people at the top are called aristocrats. The word aristos, which is what the word aristocrat comes from, the word aristos means best in Greek. So there are some people who are better than others, or at least they view themselves as that way. So the aristocrats thought they were superior to the peasants. So yeah, the aristocrats are at the top, the peasants at the bottom. They viewed their own traits as superior, and this is what creates master morality versus slave morality. So the aristocrats, of course, value strength, ambition, courage, and exceptionality, right? Because when are at the top of the hierarchy, and when you feel that you're superior to other people, when you have higher social status than the masses, then you feel that strength is valuable. You feel you like ambition. You think courage is noble, right? You think being exception is a good thing. So the aristocrats viewed the peasants as inferior and judged them negatively for being weak, mediocre, and self-effacing. Self-effacing just means humble to the point where it's like you're trying to erase yourself from history. Yeah. So the aristocrats were creators of value. In other words, they were masters of morality. The peasants were the passive recipients or slaves of morality. Thus, a natural hierarchy is established. And I have to give credit to Nietzsche because all of this is Nietzsche's ideas. Now, did the aristocrats actually create morality? Maybe not, but they felt that way. They felt that they were the creators of reality. They felt that their judgments were superior to the judgments of those beneath them, or of those they felt to be beneath them, at least. So this is the dichotomy between So the aristocrats create morality, or at least create the language or the value system, right? They view themselves as superior, and thus they viewed strong traits as superior. And it logically follows that they viewed weak traits as inferior. And so the dichotomy between master and slave morality. The master of morality creates values, right? They independently choose their own values, whereas the recipients of morality are slaves. So slave morality is just being told what to do, whereas master morality is doing what you want. Now, then comes the inversion of value. So how does master morality become slave morality? How does the dominant set of values go from aristocratic to peasant-like? And hold on. All right, sorry about that. Now, so originally, right, the locus of values was originally in the exalted minority. To be good was to be noble. To be noble was to be superior to the masses. So, I might as well kind of show this. So look, this is not working. Look, so originally, right, sorry. Right. The fuck? So to be noble was to be elevated above the masses, right? To be noble was to be selective, to be special, to be unique, right? Whereas, right. So look, initially, superiority was associated with being exclusive, being part of a club of elite minorities, whereas the masses, what was associated with universality, was considered inferior, right? So, to be noble was to be elevated beyond the masses. And then comes the inversion of the natural hierarchy, right? So now we need to, it goes upside down, right? Now, well, this picture shows it. Now, the masses are seen as superior, right? Sorry. You can see, hold on, let me just reload. So look. So now, with the inversion of values, right? The masses are superior and the minorities, right? The exceptional are inferior, right? Make this text bigger. Anyways, you get the point. Now, so the inversion of the natural hierarchy, the inversion of aristocratic values, occurs when morality becomes universalized. Now goodness is associated with the common majority rather than with the elevated minority. So that's just the definition of the inversion of values. And let me... What? You get the point. Now, aristocratic values were selective, meaning that not everyone could obtain them. Not everyone could be strong, beautiful, courageous, or magnificent. Values which could be universalized are by definition unexceptional. Thus, when morality becomes universal, values that anyone can obtain are promoted. Humility, self-effacement, submission, meekness, etc. So look, okay, when morality was exclusive, elevated, aristocratic morality, right? Not everyone can obtain nobility. Not everyone can be good, right? So because originally to be good was to be superior. To be superior was to be part of an exclusive club of elites that were greater than the masses, right? But now comes the inversion, right? The mass appeal morality, universalized morality. Everyone can be good, right? And this means that morality becomes degraded, right? Only values that everyone can achieve are considered the good ones, right? So when morality becomes universal, values that anyone can obtain are promoted. Humility, self-effacement, submission, meekness, etc. So look, not everyone can be strong. Everyone can be weak, right? So therefore, weakness becomes good, right? Not every... Look. And there's a part of this, part of the... Okay, I'll just explain it in the next slide. So as you can see, the inversion of morality. Now, the few is no longer the superior. The few are now the inferior. Now the masses are the superiors. Okay? So the inversion of morality. Why does the universalization of morality occur? Because both the elites and the masses demand this outcome. Those in power want slave morality so that people are easier to control. They want people to be unambitious and weak so they are easier to exploit and less likely to revolt. The masses also want slave morality. Many peasants resent being subjugated by the nobility. This resentment creates demand for the inversion of the original hierarchy. There are also many people who enjoy being subordinates. So basically, there are willing slaves and willing masters who want slave morality to be universalized. And I would like to add that there is an inextricable correlation between slave morality and universalized morality. Because once you believe that morality is something that should be universalized, once you believe that everyone can and should be good, then you can only promote the values that everyone can achieve, which is weakness, which is inferiority, which is ugliness, like humility, right? So only the values that everyone can achieve are now universal, which means morality becomes denigrated. It becomes downgraded, right? So the inversion of values occurs because both the elites and the masses have sufficient demand for it. Thus, the proliferation of slave morality, within which weakness, selflessness, and mediocrity are now considered good, whereas strength, ambition, and exceptionality are considered evil. Slave morality worships impotence and mediocrity. The obvious consequence is that civilization becomes weak and uncreative. People become more stupid, ugly, and cowardly. The spiritual decline of humanity is inevitable. From this trend, it is possible that civilization will collapse. Now, okay, so I want to emphasize the concept of evil now. I might be butchering Nietzsche's arguments, but the reason this concept of evil emerges, right? Because originally there was no concept of evil. Before it was just good and bad. But the concept of evil arises from resentment, right? So many peasants think that they are being discriminated against by the aristocrats, and they are right, right? So they invent this idea of evil from their resentment, right? And so now being strong is evil. It's inherently bad. It's not just bad. It's like a spiritual mistake or something like that, right? It's like you're almost less of a human because you're strong, right? So look, think about this, right? So now that the masses are glorified, now that it is good to be the universal man, it is good to be the democratic man, it is good to be like everyone else. Now mediocrity is worshipped, right? So mediocrity is good, right? Right? And exceptionality is bad, right? Being exceptional, being an aristocrat, that's actually bad, right? And obviously there's way more nuance going on, but this is just a simplified model of how morality can work. So the universalization of morality thus becomes slave morality. So now we need to talk about the story of Jesus. Very important. So, well, this is just a brief retelling. Jesus of Nazareth was a mortal man who had the courage, ambition, and conviction to fight and die for his beliefs. He deeply cared about the suffering of poor and sick people. He saw the religious and political authorities of his era as corrupt and hypocritical. Jesus demonstrated master morality. He voluntarily chose his own values. He thought that being humble, compassionate, and forgiving was virtuous, so he remained steadfast to his own principles. He opposed the external authorities of his time and stayed true to his own values. So look, Jesus is an aristocrat, right? Jesus created his own value. Jesus is an example of master morality, right? Jesus is an aristocrat, not not a democratic moralist, okay? And yes, democratic moralist, universal morality, slave morality, they're the same thing. Thank you, Nisha. Now, sorry, where's the, yeah. So, yeah, so because Jesus had so much energy, he transferred his value to the masses. And this is something Nietzsche talked about, that when you are the Superman, when you are a natural aristocrat, you have so much energy, you have an abundance of will to power that you expand your values to everyone, right? This Jesus was an example of an Ubermensch. So master morality is about independently forming your own values and defending them against external forces. Now, so the passion of Jesus is the supreme expression of the hero myth through the divine logos. So I'll talk more about the hero myth and the logos. Yeah. The hero myth, so this is the fundamental structure of the hero myth, which every single story has the same structure. So, I mean, I'll show it here. Look, how do I erase everything? Can I add a page here? There we go. Right. the fuck? So this is the hero narrative. Right. So this is the narrative structure of the hero myth. Look. Right. And often, um, the descent into chaos is something like it's really about facing adversity. And so, for example, you have to slay a dragon. So let's give an example. Is this a paintbrush? Yeah. Right. You have to slay the dragon. Right. Now, after you slay the dragon, you remember this is very important actually, because why is it? Why is this text? I can't see the text for some reason. There you go. Yes. So the hero chooses to face adversity. Right. This is very important because the hero demonstrates master morality. Right. Look, to be a master of morality, to create your own values, that means choosing your own values. That means the opposite of having values imposed onto you. You choose to be a hero, you choose to take the leap of faith, you choose to demonstrate courage, to fight and die for your beliefs, and you face adversity. See, that is what it means to be a hero. It's master morality. Right? Now, look. So you slay the dragon, and then you get treasure. Now, where the fuck is the. Right, so how do I change the color? So, for some reason, there's no. Hold on a second. Menu bar at the top of GS Paint. File. The colors menu is at the. Really, is it? Oh, dare. What? So you're telling me. Okay. Now look. Sorry, I'm trying to. Okay, so look. So you want to be a hero, right? You exist in some initial state of order. This is, I guess you can call it the status quo. Right. Now, and then you have to emerge into the opposite of order. What is the opposite of order? Right? It's chaos. It's chaos. Okay? And so um the only way to improve the status quo is by going into chaos, right? So chaos is what, why is this so difficult to use? Hold on. Chaos is infinite possibility and formless potential, right? And chaos might not literally be infinite possibility, but you experience it like that. So there's formless potential, but there's also an existential threat, right? So you don't know what's gonna happen if you um leave the status quo. You don't know what's gonna happen if you leave civilization and go into the wilderness, right? This is another way to think of chaos. It's wilderness, whereas order is civilization, right? I don't know why the words keep disappearing. Right. So order is civilization. Now look. So you want to be a hero, you have to leave the status quo and go into chaos, right? And face adversity, right? Being a hero requires facing adversity because if you don't face adversity, then you're not really a hero. You're just a random person, right? So you face adversity and then you succeed, right? You slay the dragon, or I don't know, you do the difficult task. I don't know, right? And then you re-emerge with the novel treasure and share it with the people. So every single hero myth, at least every celebrated hero myth, is like this. So what's the novel treasure? The novel treasure might be gold, right? So after you slay the dragon, you get a bunch of gold. Or it could be a metaphor for something else. Like maybe rather than actual wealth, right? You achieve spiritual enlightenment. You achieve some kind of knowledge, right? And now you can share it. You share it with the people, okay? And this makes yes, you have to bring back the treasure and share. Sorry. You bring back the treasure and share it with the people. And now the world becomes a better place because you have achieved a higher state of enlightenment. And because the world is always certain, because chaos will always return. Third, and also the forces of evil will always return. Remember, the forces of evil, by definition, are always associated with chaos because they're against the status quo. Usually, right? At least they're either against the current status quo or the status quo you want, right? So after you make the world a better place, you create a better status quo, right? But the issue is that the evil will reemerge, chaos will reemerge, and so you have to so you're back to the status quo, and then you need to, as a hero, you need to go back into the chaos and keep saving the world, right? So the world is never saved for good. Chaos never disappears. The status quo is always uncertain and unstable. So you need to constantly be engaging in the hero myth. This is the very pattern of how creation occurs. This is the pattern of how you change the world for better. And so the hero myth is very important because it's actually the literary equivalent of how we experience the world. But I'll go into this later. So look, go back here. Sorry. So the passion of Jesus, so the story of Jesus, is the supreme expression of the hero myth through the divine logos. The hero myth is the hero voluntarily facing adversity and triumphs. After he succeeds, he brings treasure back to his community to share with the people. So this is just the common theme throughout all hero myths, right? It's this, right? And remember, the voluntary part is very important. It has to be a voluntary descent. It has to show master morality. Otherwise, you're just a slave. It's like you're just gonna fight for the IDF and you're gonna die for Benjamin Netanyahu for no reason, right? That's what slave morality is. Master morality is being uncoerced, having your own independent ideas, and defending your own values. So the logos is the word of God, the pattern of behavior which connects the material world with the divine. The logos is what moves us closer to the eternal good, right? That's what God is, the eternal good. So the story, Jesus will be so heroic, or at least be considered so heroic, that it will be as if that he's not just a great hero, he's a divine hero. Is that if we embody the pattern of Jesus, if we mimic what Jesus does, then not only will we be a hero, but we will become closer to God. So the passion story. Jesus voluntarily faces the tyrants of his time, like the religious and political tyrants, and he dies for his faith. He refuses the temptation of Satan. He defeats death, right, by resurrecting, and he ascends to heaven. He redeems humanity of its sins. And I would like to give credit to Jordan Peterson. Now, the passion is an exceptional moral narrative because it contains both the greatest adversity, so conflict against political and religious tyranny, and conflict against Satan, and being tortured to death on the cross. So the passion story contains the greatest adversity and the greatest success: resurrection, ascent into heaven, redemption of mankind's sins. So the passion story of Christ, right? Right. This is about the logos. Okay. So you can think of it this way. Bro. So look, through the pattern of the logos, right? Sorry, let me make this a bit more clear. So through the pattern of the logos, Jesus connects earth with heaven and hell. And what Jesus does is he descends into hell, right? And then he defeats death, right? He not only does he defeat death, right? He resurrects. Sorry. So look, he defeats death. He defeats death. Right? And he defeats Satan. So look. So Jesus Jesus spawns on earth as a normal man, okay? And what's very impressive is that he's able to defeat Satan, and he defeats death, and he defeats, the political tyrants of his time, right? And so he voluntarily descends into chaos, right? Which is what? Sorry. Where is it? Yes, so the hero voluntarily descends into chaos, which is, in this case, Jesus descends into hell, which is the worst possible chaos. and he confronts his adversity with courage, right? So he defeats hell. He also defeats the political tyrants on earth. So on earth, right? So defeats all of them. And and by doing so, right? The resurrecting part is very important because he descends into hell, he resurrects, and he goes to heaven, and then he comes back as the Holy Spirit, right? The Logos. And he redeems mankind. He redeems humanity of their sins, and he makes the world a better place, right? So if you think about it, the Passion story is actually perhaps the greatest hero myth because the descent into chaos is as intense as possible. Okay, but think about it. He's confronted by Satan in the desert while starving, and he refuses Luciferian temptation. He refuses to budge against the political tyrants of his time, right? He is tortured to death in excruciating pain, right? He dies. And, you know, because people love him so much, because he is such a great hero, he is able to resurrect in the hearts of the people. And therefore, his courage becomes multiplied. Jesus's gift of redemption through his courage is so powerful that it inspires millions or billions of people, right, to follow in his footsteps. Now, look. So the Passion story is an exceptional moral narrative because it contains both the greatest adversity and the greatest success. Jesus exemplifies the archetypical hero, master morality, and the divine logos. Remember, the logos is the Holy Spirit. It's the process by which the material world is connected to the divine. Right? So many virtues are condensed into the legacy of one man that he becomes the apotheosis of heroism and morality. So he becomes the best example of what it means to be a hero and what it means to be a good person. That is why even today, the story of Jesus is considered by many to be the foundation of Western civilization. So now we talk about how slave morality ruined the symbol of Christ, right? And let me actually, yeah. You know, I really should have saved those images. Anyways. Okay, so look, this is Christ the hero, and this is Christ the sacrificial lamb, right? And this is he's a Chad, and the Christ the hero is a Chad. Christ the sacrificial lamb is a virgin. Now look, hold on, let me wait. Hold on, I gotta make this text font bigger. So look, okay? So look, right? There's a difference between how slave morality and master morality will view um, the story of Christ, right? If you think about it, Christ was a very independent and ambitious man. He had his own values, right? He cared for the poor, he cared for the sick. He wanted to stand up against the external authorities of his time. He was against corruption. He was against the religious and political leaders of his time. And he fought and died on his own terms and by his own beliefs, right? He was a Chad. He was a demonstration of master morality. He created his own values and imposed them on the world successfully because even after he died, people were willing to follow him to death, right? He was the Ubermensch. Whereas if you want to see Christ from a slave morality perspective, then you can say, okay, Christ was a weakling, right? He was a starved, malnourished man who had no choice but to be a slave for his divine father, right? So he's forced by his father to die on a cross. So he died for someone else's values, right? He is a slave to divine authority, right? And so the Catholic Church will use this view of Christ as a sacrificial lamb to enslave the illiterate masses. They will say, look, Jesus was a weak man who was tortured to death for divine authority, and us, the Catholic Church, we are the divine authorities. Therefore, you should listen to us, or we will kill you for being a heretic, or we're gonna force you to die on crusades or whatever, right? You will die for us, and this is like Americans dying for Benjamin Netanyahu. Why should you die for the values of Netanyahu? Because you are a slave. Because you shouldn't be a master. You shouldn't create your own values. You shouldn't even independently think for yourself. You should just be sacrificed to someone else's values. That is what it means to serve the IDF, which is what America does, right? This is just an example. Now, forget about that. So, this is just the general pattern. Did I already explain this? Yeah. This is just the general pattern of moral universalization applied to Christianity. So let me go back here, actually. Right? Morality becomes universalized, right? You can't universalize master morality because not everyone can be strong, but everyone can be weak, right? Everyone can be a pussy. So, because everyone can you can cut off anyone's arm, right? So, Christianity becomes slave morality. The story of Christ becomes a story of slavery rather than mastery. Right? So, the general pattern of moral universalization, which is slave morality, is applied to Christianity. Christianity becomes a religion that appeals to the masses. The process of universalization inevitably degrades the original value it transmits. The selective aristocratic values that Jesus demonstrates, courage, ambition, defiance against authority, moral independence, are inverted for slave morality. Rather than viewing Christ as a symbol of master morality, only his superficial virtues that anyone can perform are retained. That's the process of universalization. Furthermore, Christ is viewed only as a retainer of submissive values, slave morality. So look, the first part is this, okay? Only virtues that anyone could perform, right? Mostly humility, right? Anyone can be humble, anyone can be weak. Right? Think about what the symbol of the cross is. All right. On one hand, you can say this is a symbol of weakness of weakness. It is good to be weak because to be weak means you are obeying the Catholic Church. To be weak means you are obeying the authorities. To be weak is to obey the IDF, which is good because you should die for Israel for no reason, right? That's good. Now, on the other hand, it's a showcase of strength and courage, right? You are willing to die for your beliefs, and therefore you are remarkable, right? You have your own values that you're willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for. That's not something everyone can do, actually. Not everyone can form their own values and then be willing to martyr for them. But everyone can be a bitch and martyr for someone else's beliefs, right? Anyone can be someone else's slave, right? So look, rather than viewing Christ as a symbol of master morality, only his superficial virtues that anyone can perform are retained. So only his weakness is retained. Furthermore, Christ is viewed only as a retainer of submissive values. So now, the symbol of the crucifixion becomes denigrated to support slave morality. So look, right? The symbol of the cross, the crucifixion, now is used to glorify weakness, right? And this is very disgusting. So Christ is interpreted as a submissive lamb rather than a valiant hero. In other words, the lens of slave morality is used to mistranslate the Passion story. Rather than an independent hero who chooses his own values and defied the authorities of his time, Christ is now considered a humble and selfless man who submits to the values of his Father. The original master values of courage, ambition, defiance against authority, and moral independence are inverted into slave values: selflessness, submission to divine authority, and suffering for the greater good. So this is this process right here, right? So look, it's this process of the Chad becoming the virgin, right? Of master morality becoming slave morality, right? Of Übermensch becoming Untermensch, right? Like rather than having your own values and being the master, you become a slave to the IDF. So look, why did this happen? It's because the priestly class, like St. Paul and his successors, recognized an opportunity to amass power for themselves. If they can use religion to promote slave morality, then they will have followers that are easier to control. They're easier to exploit for resources and labor. Historically, we can observe that both the Catholic Church and the Roman Empire used Christianity as a means to oppress the illiterate masses. There is a convergence of interest between priestly and imperial power. Orthodoxy justifies killing heretics, crusades, and other atrocities in the quote-unquote name of Jesus. You can't question the Catholic Church because Jesus was selfless and weak, so you should be like him as well. So look, I already explained. So why does the inversion of natural values happen? Why does master morality become denigrated into slave morality? Why does the aristocratic values become peasant morality? Because those in power want slave morality, the priests and the Roman Empire, right? They want slave morality. They want people to be easier to control. And the masses also, some of them want to be slaves, and some of them are resentful against the nobility. So they want the universalization of values, which ultimately becomes slave morality, because strength cannot be universalizable, at least not in the relative sense, right? But everyone can be weak. Now look. So the moral narrative of the Passion is rewritten. Due to the convergence of moral universalization, slave morality, and priestly self-interest, so the priests want to exploit the masses and to have a monopoly of truth over the illiterate masses. Moral universalization and slave morality are really the same thing. Christ's story shifts from master morality to slave morality. So from his courage, rather than his courage being emphasized, his self-sacrifice is emphasized. Rather than his active heroism being emphasized, his passive victimhood on the cross. His passive victimhood is emphasized rather than his valiant and courageous act of heroism. From his defiance of corrupt authority to his submission to divine authority. So rather than saying that Christ is someone who stood up against authority, he was actually someone who submitted to authority, right? That's a very important distinction. Because the Catholic Church wants you to think, oh, Christ submitted to authority. No. In fact, if Christ was alive during the Catholic Church, if Christ was alive for longer, right, and let's say he saw the burning of the heretics, right, he saw the Crusades, he would not support any of this. I mean, why would, like he would, in fact, if Christ was alive for a second time, or actually, if someone had the same values that Jesus had, they would probably be burnt at the stake by the Catholic Church, And that's actually what the Catholic Church did. Like literally, they just burned heretics for um doing what Jesus would have done. That's actually diabolical, right? Like there's literally there were opposing sects that were against that were like different from Catholicism. They had a different faith, not different faith, but like they had a different understanding of orthodoxy, or they were against orthodoxy, right? And they just supported humility, right? They just wanted to live an impoverished lifestyle because they thought that the material world was evil. They thought that being kind was what was most divine. And what the Catholic Church did was they killed them, right? Because they did what Jesus would have actually done, they killed them. And that's actually what the Catholic Church is. It's a perversion of Christ. Christianity is a perversion of Christ. It's an insult. Now, so the story of Christ is denigrated from someone who selects his own value to being told what to do by his Father God. So, the moral of the Christian narrative goes from be a brave hero against all adversity to be a sacrificial lamb for the authority. So don't be Chad, right? Be virgin. Don't be master, be slave, right? Now, look. So then the Trinity is invented to justify the slave morality of Orthodox Christianity. And this is because the priests want... Okay, so I need to make another one. Hold on. Trinity, right? But the most important part is that Christ, the mortal man, equals immortal. So this is the contradiction that I'm focused on. Yes, the Trinity is incoherent, but this is what the priests want. Because there's two different ways you can view the story of Christ. Right. Right. See, these are supposed to be wings. Got a halo here. Sorry. So Christ as a mortal died for what he believed in, showed courage, admits courage despite uncertainty of success. So he didn't know. So Christ as a mortal, if you think of him as a mortal man, he didn't know that his faith would actually allow him to be symbolically resurrected in the hearts of many people. He didn't know that people would necessarily care about him to the extent that they do now, right? He didn't know what was going to happen to him, right? And he actually sacrificed his own life. Whereas Christ as an immortal, so look, Christ as an immortal, he actually didn't even sacrifice his own life. So he actually didn't show any courage because all he really did was press the respawn button, right? Like if your dad is God, right, or you're omnipotent yourself, or you're omniscient, right? The whole adversity you face is a complete sham. Like if you're the nepo baby of God, like bro, you do some magic tricks, right? And then you turn your blood into wine or whatever. And it's like, okay, cool. That's not none of that's impressive if you're omnipotent. Also, um, the whole idea of sacrificing yourself to redeem mankind for its sins, that only makes sense if you're mortal. If you're immortal, um, it's not real sacrifice. It's like if you have infinite respawns in Minecraft and you just press the respawn button, that's not a real death, right? So he doesn't actually show any courage, right? No courage shown. And the problem is that the priests, right? The priests want Christ to be considered actually omnipotent so that the symbol of Christ is morally unquestionable, right? So that, okay, Christ is omnipotent, right? So if you dare challenge the authority of the Catholic Church, you're challenging the symbol of omnipotence, and therefore you're wrong, right? You have to be. But you're not allowed to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church because that would be challenging the authority of the immortal and omnipotent Christ. But what they didn't want, right? They didn't want to lose moral credibility, right? And that's the problem. That's why they try to, sorry, right? That's why they try to reconcile Christ as an immortal with Christ as a mortal. That's why they had to invent the retarded idea of the Trinity, right? Because they didn't want to lose moral credibility, right? If Christ is immortal, then he doesn't actually show any courage, right? So they have to somehow combine Christ the man with Christ the God, and they fail because it actually makes no sense. So look, the Trinity is invented to justify the slave morality of Orthodox Christianity. The priests want Christ to have the moral credibility of a mortal martyr, so someone who actually sacrificed his life, and the unquestionable authority of an omnipotent deity. Right? So they invent the Trinity in order to assert that Jesus is both a mortal and God himself, which is impossible. This makes absolutely no sense. This is how they tell, this is now, no, so now they tell the masses, Jesus sacrificed himself for the higher authority, and Jesus is God, so what he did is 100% correct and unquestionable. Therefore, now you should sacrifice your entire life for me too, right? Like Benjamin Netanyahu. The same thing as the Catholic Church, right? You have to die for me because I said so. Now a problem emerges. First, the Trinity is a contradiction and logically incoherent. But if the Trinity is taken seriously, then it means that Christ is immortal. That means he was not actually a martyr. Since he is omnipotent, he cannot actually die, right? As I explained. So the story of Christ as a mortal is denigrated into the story of Christ as an immortal. So remember, the story of Christ as a mortal, right? This is actually the superior version of the story. It becomes denigrated into the story, into him being immortal. Because now he doesn't actually sacrifice his life. He doesn't even show any courage. Right? He already knows what's going to happen to him. So how can he be scared? And he knows he can resurrect. He's God. He has infinite respawn buttons. Right? So yeah. In the Christ as an immortal narrative, Jesus did not actually face adversity because he is omniscient and omnipotent. He did not actually face death because he knew he could just press the respawn button like he was playing Minecraft. So look, he's omniscient, right? He knew everything that was going to happen. He knew he was going to be resurrected in the end. So how is that a sacrifice of your own life, right? The original understanding of Christ as a mortal is what makes the story relatable and inspiring. A normal person can demonstrate so much courage and symbolically resurrect in the hearts of people. So the original story of Christ as a mortal, this is inspiring, right? This is inspiring, relatable, and possible to mimic, right? People are inspired that a mortal man could die for what he believed in, could at least symbolically, right, resist the temptations of Lucifer. He can symbolically resurrect in the hearts of many men, right? And he showed courage against the political and religious authorities of his time. And he is a hero, right? A demonstration of master morality. He creates his own values and lives by the sword, dies by the sword, right? He is a valiant and courageous person, right? Whereas Christ as an immortal, right? First of all, it's actually less relatable, right? Because you can't really relate to the idea of like knowing you're gonna resurrect. Like you don't know you're gonna resurrect, right? You're not omniscient, you're not omnipotent, right? So you can't relate to this new Trinitarian Christ. And this is the definition of slave morality, right? Because now the Catholic Church uses this as a symbol of obedience. Right. So now rather than it's a less relatable story, and it's a story about how you should just obey the Holy Father. You should just die, not for your own values, but for someone else's values. And so this is pure cuckoldry. So now, thus, the general pattern of moral universalization, culminating in slave morality, occurs with Christian morality. In other words, Christ is degraded as a vessel for slave morality from his proper form as a symbol of master morality and the embodied logos, right? So yeah, like I explained, master morality, Christ used to be an example of master morality. Now he's just a vessel for slave morality. Now he's just a vessel for the interests of power. The consequences of slave morality are spiritual stagnation and decline. The collapse of every civilization that adheres to slave morality is a possibility. People become moral parasites rather than creators. They must be told what to do and therefore become nihilistic and weak. It is because of moral universalization that people today are fat, ugly, and stupid. Right? So this is very important. So there are creators of value and there are parasites. Right? And they correspond master, slave. So when people adhere to slave morality, they become parasites. They become dependent on external validation. They have to follow authority because otherwise they don't know what to do, right? They have to sacrifice themselves on the cross for someone else's values. They cannot independently think for themselves, right? Whereas, so basically, because people adhere to slave morality and because they become parasites, what you have to understand is that parasites don't actually exist, right? They're dependent on someone else. So it's almost like because a parasite has no self-existent, he actually isn't there. It's like if you're just an NPC and you live according to someone else's will, you aren't even there. Your brain is like just a tool of someone else's brain, you know? And so this is how when everyone's a slave, this can lead to civilizational collapse. Am I spelling that correctly? Yeah. And this leads to civilizational thriving, right? Master morality, right? Because you create value, you create more magnificence in the world, right? Right? There's a difference between creating culture and being, you can say, even colonized. Anyways. And it's very demoralizing when people adhere to slave morality, right? Right? People become nihilistic and weak. Whereas with master morality, you can create your own values, right? So you're magnificent, strong, right? you have values that you're so intimately willing to live for that you're willing to die for them. That's where your strength comes from. Whereas if you have slave morality, you feel that you don't even own yourself. You feel that you don't even exist, right? So you just become a vessel for nihilism and weakness, right? And that's why people today are fat, ugly, and stupid, right? Because if your life doesn't even have value, then you're going to spiritually atrophy, and that's going to affect your body as well and your brain. And obviously, this is just um, a model of reality, just way more nuanced than this, but it's just useful to think about. So now I want to talk more about the hero myth and the Christian logos. So what is the hero myth? It is a universal narrative pattern. It is a literary form that transfers courage and virtue to people. The hero myth teaches people how to creatively navigate a world of meaning through metaphors and allegories. A hero myth will glorify master morality. A propaganda story will glorify slave morality. So a hero myth is culturally universal. Every culturally universal. Every culture has hero myths. Otherwise, you can't instill courage in the population. You can't inculcate your children with the desire to die for your people, right? And well, for this to be valid, people have to consent to wanting to die for a nation. Which is far different from just being told what to do. So the hero myth teaches people how to creatively navigate a world of meaning through metaphors and allegories. A hero myth will glorify master morality. A propaganda story will glorify slave morality. So look, let's show this distinction, right? Look, hero myth, propaganda myth, right? All right, so this is the difference between a hero myth and a propaganda myth. So, in a hero myth, you choose to face adversity, right? Slay the dragon, and then you get rewarded because the angels will preside over you, and the angels will see that you have done good for the world, and therefore they will reward you, right? This is just metaphorical. Now, the propaganda myth happens like this. The propaganda is where, the tyrants, the state or the authorities, right? They tell you, okay, you're going to die for us, right? And why? Well, there's no reason why. You're the slave, right? 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 So you are the slave and you will die for the leader, right? And now, whereas for a hero, right, because you voluntarily choose your own values and you voluntarily choose to fight, right? The reward is genuine, the adversity is genuine, right? Whereas, if you somehow survive, okay, if you somehow survive over here, I mean, you're lucky, but it's not really. I know it's not a very fulfilling experience. Anyway, so that's the difference between a hero myth and a propaganda poster, right? Now, so every hero story has the same fundamental pattern. The hero voluntarily descends into chaos. He chooses what values he is willing to fight for and confronts his adversity with courage, right? The hero emerges from adversity with a novel treasure, enlightenment, gold, or healing potions. These are just examples. He rescues the world from the forces of evil. He shares his treasure with the community and makes the world a better place. The archetypical hero myth is the literary equivalent of how we experience reality in a world of meaning. The way in which we experience action, purposeful behavior towards a goal is analogous to the hero myth. We experience a world of meaning. In this world of meaning, we constantly face chaos. The chaos is the horizon of infinite possibilities that we convert into actuality. The hero creates a habitable order out of chaos. Okay, so this is very metaphorical and abstract. I want to give credit to Jordan Peterson and Maps of Meaning. So the problem is I'm trying to explain something that can't be explained by language. Jordan Peterson has failed to explain this. I will also fail to explain this. This is just comes to the territory. So, sorry. Let me try to explain this the best I can. So, the archetypical hero myth is the literary equivalent of how we experience reality in the world of meaning. Let me try to explain this. So the hero myth is the literary version of how you're supposed to experience reality in a heroic way. Look. Actually, hold on. Let me make this way bigger. Right? Right. So the purpose of right. So the purpose of good literature is to reorient how you experience the world. Right. It's also to sort of describe the patterns that you're already experiencing. It gives you psychological insights. So the way in which we experience action, purposeful behavior towards a goal, is analogous to the hero myth. So let's think about this, right? What is action? Action is purposeful behavior for a goal, right? And so here's the goal, right? Whatever goal it is, goal. And the goal is, I don't know, and ultimately every goal is making the world a better place. At least you think it is, right? So if you achieve, the reason you strive for a goal is because you think it will make your experience better, generally. So we experience a world of meaning. So this is the individual consciousness. This is the individual that experiences the world, right? Maybe I should. Right, look. Right, so this is you right here. And you engage in action. Hold on, I gotta. Can I draw? Let me see. I need to make this drawing better. Sorry. Right. And now, in this world, you're always in the middle You're always sandwiched between chaos and order. So look. So order is the structure of reality that you experience, the rules, the civilization, the status quo. And chaos is experienced as infinite possibility, formless potential, mysterious forces, right? So this is how you're always stuck between chaos and order. So because you understand the world from the perspective of the status quo, which is the rules of the civilization, the structure of reality, right? Like the normal world that you experience. It's the only structured way you understand the world. But there's always chaos. There's always some aspect of reality that the order can't explain, right? And so you experience chaos as infinite possibility because there's infinite mystery to the world from vectors that you do not understand. And so you can almost think of that as formless potential and mysterious forces, right? And now the chaos is the horizon of infinite possibilities that we convert into actuality. So what you do in action, what you do when you do anything, is that you convert what you do is that you are this picture is very bad, but so in action, right? What you do in action is that you convert chaos into a new world, right? And so you convert chaos into order, right? And the very experience of consciousness, the way in which we experience the world is that we are always at the border between chaos and order, and we are also at the border between infinite possibility and actuality. So the consciousness is at the border of possibility, and we convert that chaotic possibility into something real, something that actually manifests in the material world. So the purpose of consciousness is to convert possibility into actuality. Right? The purpose of consciousness, convert infinite possibility of chaos into actuality, and thereby improving the order of society or reality, right? And so this is how we experience the world. And I haven't done a very good job of explaining this, but I don't think it's actually possible to explain these things with language. Maybe someone better can, but I don't think Jordan Peterson even succeeded. Like, I've read Maps of Meaning. Okay, Jordan Peterson is one of my favorite philosophers, but maybe I'm misunderstanding something. Maybe nobody actually understands this, but I think this is pointing at something real that I can't, for some reason, I don't know how to explain it. But anyways, so the pattern, now let's go talk about the pattern of the divine logos, which is really just an embodied version of the hero myth that like almost connects to the divine, right? Or does connect to the divine, you could say. So Christ, the logos, Christ faces adversity from the material and spiritual world. In the material world, he is in conflict with religious and political tyrants and faces an excruciating death through the crucifixion. From the spiritual realm, he resisted the temptations of Satan. Christ successfully overcomes the tyrants of his time by remaining truthful to his own values. He overcomes Satan in the desert. He overcomes death, resurrects, and ascends to heaven. He becomes the Holy Spirit and blesses mankind with divine redemption. So it's almost like the perfect hero story. It's the most possible adversity you could face plus the greatest possible success, right? So that's why so much value is condensed into the passion story that it becomes, you could argue it becomes the bedrock of Western civilization. So the moral perfection of the Christian passion. The weakest and most innocent person is tortured in the most unjust manner possible. However, this imbalance between Christ's innocence and his unjust torture vindicates Jesus and proves him to not just be a great hero, but a divine hero. This narrative combination of the most innocent man possibly being tortured, the most innocent man possible, this narrative combination of the most innocent man possible being tortured as cruelly as possible is exaggerated it's an exaggerated moral pattern which people who have been mistreated can relate to. So anyone can relate to this pattern because it's so exaggerated. It's so clear, the delineation, the difference between Christ's innocence and the unjust torture that he suffered, right? And so this is it's almost like the perfect archetypical hero story. So the narrative conclusion of Christ rising from death and proving his faith in the Logos to be true is what makes it not only a hero myth, but a divine hero myth that is compatible with connecting mankind. That is capable. So the Christian story is a divine hero myth that is capable of connecting mankind with God. Thus, the story of Christ, when understood as a universally relatable hero myth, is a masterpiece with immense moral value. This is the kind of story that can serve as the foundation of a thriving civilization. Without religious hero myths, there is risk that humanity will lose transcendent values. Without transcendent values, nihilism can proliferate. When the world becomes nihilistic, then there is no reliable way to prevent evil forces from taking over. So transcendent values are something that can't be fully understood because they're always beyond the individual, they're always beyond comprehension. It is because Christianity could successfully combine spiritual purpose with heroism, which is master morality, that it could be a strong foundation for transcendent moral values. However, because the symbol of Christ has been poisoned by slave morality, Christianity has become a destroyer of virtue rather than a source of virtue. It is a grave error to denigrate the image of Christ, to treat him as a sacrificial lamb rather than a valiant hero. So Christ is not a slave, Christ is a master. If people are taught that being weak and submissive is virtuous, then civilization becomes mediocre and nihilistic. If people are taught to independently create and fight for their own values, then civilization becomes energetic and prosperous. Right? Now, so look, let's talk about transcendent values. And this is the very function of religion. So look, right? So with religion, the purpose of a religious hero myth, right? The hero myth is something culturally universal, but if you combine that with religion, then you can have a foundation for transcendent values. And what are transcendent values? It's something like spirituality plus morality plus some connection with the divine, right? And if a society has a strong bedrock of transcendent values, then it can be creative and prosperous, right? It can be magnificent. You can even say that it's aligned with heaven, right? Guarded by angels. Now, what's the alternative? Okay. A lack of religion. Well, that's atheism, which leads to materialism. And because materialism implies that there's no innate moral values, or at least not objective, right? Then what happens is moral relativism, which is the same as nihilism, basically. There's no objective value. There's right. So all that matters. So ultimately, Well, I mean, nihilism actually leads to hedonism, leads to bureaucratism, which leads to right, because the problem with bureaucratism is that well, okay, first let me explain the jump from hedonism to bureaucratism. So hedonism is basically consequentialism, right? Or utilitarianism. Same thing, right? You're either maximizing utility or you're maximizing the best consequences. Same thing. And because life has no inherent value, all that matters is maximizing pleasure or the best consequences, whatever, right? So this secular consequentialism becomes bureaucratism, which basically means administrative systems, these nihilistic administrative system control society, right? And then these bureaucracies, right? These are what bureaucracies are. These bureaucracies make people into conformists and create, and these bureaucracies expand like parasites, and they allow for massive amounts of corruption, right? Because everyone's a conformist, everyone just follows rules for no reasons, right? That's what these oversized administrative systems are. They just expand and keep making up new arbitrary rules for no reason. They're nihilists, right? They're nihilists who want more power, so they just make up a bunch of bullshit rules, and so they can steal more money from the people, and they can engage in corruption, and so they become incompetent and weak, right? And that's why ultimately, because of this nihilism and weakness, society becomes taken over by satanic forces, right? Because like, these bureaucracies are just empty reservoirs of power. These bureaucracies are just passive supplies of power for Jeffrey Epstein to take advantage of, right? And so that is the problem when you ignore transcendent values. Now, this path, on the other hand, you can be cynical and say this path has never even happened, right? But at least it's something to strive for. Anyways, so that is the problem with slave morality, and that is how slave morality ruined the symbol of Christ. Now, is there a solution to this problem? I can't think of any, but nonetheless, I think this is a very important concept. And on that note, elevate them.